I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nira Izakovich, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. So, Nir, you were the one who got excited by this topic this week. You want to tell us why?
Yeah, so we are going to talk about facilitating democracy with technology, and I've been interested for a while about this idea of AI in particular and other technological means facilitating democratic participation, trying to see if there's anything to learn from some other countries that do it, and whether that sort of increases excitement about politics or potentially increases detachment and alienation. So maybe let's start by looking at Taiwan that does some interesting stuff in this space. So say people in Taiwan are debating, I don't know, I'm making this up, are debating legalizing gambling or, putting some money into some big infrastructure projects. In recent years, I'd say in the last 10 years or so, part of how this would work there is digitally, namely through a software called Pol.is, which is a open source democratic participation software that Taiwan and other countries use. Authorities would send out a large number of text messages. And then, I think in the tens or even hundreds of thousands. A smaller number of those would be chosen by the software as a kind of focus group, maybe like 400 people or so, a few hundred people would be chosen as a focus group, and that focus group would have an AI facilitated discussion of the suggested policy, like what do you do about the speed limit? What do you do about funding the infrastructure projects or about legalizing gambling? The AI would, so they'd have a large Zoom conversation basically, something like it. The AI would prompt people who are not participating to participate. And then a large language model would do some content analysis on the conversation, pick out some salient themes and float those themes up to
But
policymakers.
let me just stop you. The Polis, I think, also does one really interesting thing that other systems like this don't, and that's it segments the views of the people who start responding, and it
Hmm.
upvotes people's whose views instead of just reposting or liking people who are like you can do that. You can like the comments that are from people who are like you, but go ahead.
Right.
But it upvotes in particular the comments that are liked by people in the other groups in the debate, right? So it identifies which groups are in the debate, and if someone from group A has something that group B likes, then that gets upvoted. And so it tries to build consensus through that method, which I think is a fascinating aspect of it. But go ahead.
Right. And once the conversation is done, themes from it that are taken to be representative are floated up to policy making levels, right? And it forms the basis of both policy discussion and policy making. So it's kind of a system for creating real-time participation in democratic decision making that is supposed to, increase the sense of buy-in from the population and increase the sense of reactiveness and responsiveness from government. And so places like Taiwan, places like Finland, I think Estonia also do various versions of the same thing.
Mhm.
Now, in Taiwan, it depends on a few things, if I'm understanding correctly. First of all, is, a wide access to broadband, and they see broadband as a human rights there from some conversations that I listen to, but also there's a sort of tradition of education and tech literacy and tech competence and so on. So something like that is the Taiwan case study. What's your sense of that? Is that real political participation? Is that good for democracy? Is that something that you would like to see here? Something that you think we could replicate here?
I think it's a great idea. Just to go back to some of the roots of it. It came out of the Sunflower movement, the pro-democracy movement in Taiwan, which also gave rise to the leader Audrey Tang, who is an advocate for all kinds of e-democracy experimentation and became the first digital minister in 2016. And Audrey was buoyed and a product of a movement there called gov-zero, which was a kind of state-sponsored hackathons for e-democracy applications. Something that I think is in itself a fantastic innovation. And I just want to mention also that the Pol.is system is used by the vTaiwan deliberation platform, but they also have a system called Join, and we'll have links in the show notes. But Join allows citizens to sponsor petitions if they can get 5,000 signatures, and then the petitions have to be deliberated on by face-to-face meetings with government officials. So they have not only the top-down aspect of putting questions to the citizenry and having them debate them, but also the bottom-up kind of petition initiatives, as well as a variety of other e-democracy reforms. Interestingly, not electronic voting, because they have been subject to cyber meddling in their elections from mainland China for a long time. So they decided that in order to avoid the situations that we've had here and elsewhere of people saying that the election was stolen or electronically manipulated or something, they stuck with their paper ballots. But everything else they're trying to do electronically, citizen participation. So what do I think of it? I think in general, we've had a decline of intermediate institutions that are vital for liberal democracy. Decline in church participation, although church participation is still a big driver of electoral participation in the US, but a decline of all other kinds of non-governmental organizations that used to be the kind of intermediary aspects with the state. And what we've got as now is the opportunity to build direct participatory democracy with, it makes more sense at the local level. So there's experiments in various places with like participatory budgeting. There's also state and federal experiments with participation. And when you're talking about a small country like Taiwan or South Korea or Estonia, it's more like an urban participatory platform. But I think that's great. And what I'm looking for is, can electronic tools and methods supplement for the messier and potentially less representative forms of face-to-face communication that we had before? What I think some of the criticisms have already been leveled against these platforms are that they're not as participatory as people think they are, because still the kinds of people who participate are the same kinds of people who would have participated, in other ways electorally. And that a lot of complex issues are not amenable to simple, tell me what you think about these three statements and let's debate it. They're much more complex than that. So I think that, for me, that's one of the questions that hangs over the whole field, is whether the idea of participatory democracy actually scales, or whether electronic tools can actually help participatory democracy scale, or whether that's just a mirage and a vehicle for political legitimacy.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, at least in the case of Taiwan, the software itself is supposed to take care of the question of representativeness of the sample. So that seems like it's a technically solvable question. I mean, look, one question that I had as I was learning more about this, and by the way, there's an excellent podcast from The Economist that focuses in on the Taiwan case, is what level of trust in government has to be there as a precondition for any of this to work. So this seems to require some kind of pre-existing relationship between citizens and their governments, or pre-existing set of attitudes where, citizens don't think that their government is, almost by definition corrupt or a swamp or dysfunctional. So sort of the American rhetoric, both from the left or of the right, that we're going into, change the capital and change the political culture. Something that is a bit the opposite seems to be going on here, right? Where people have a basic sense of political trust that allows them to think my views as they're expressed through this software are going to be taken seriously in the first place. I don't see that at the moment being a real possibility here. So there's a political culture that we don't have that maybe they do have in Taiwan and Estonia and in Finland and some of the places that are trying this.
Well, I think that's an important part of the context, is that new democracies may take these vehicles and technologies more seriously than our older democracies. It may be harder for us to adapt. Although the rapid adoption of mail-in balloting in the U.S., at least the rapid adoption by some, has been, relatively seamless in most cases. So I think we could see various kinds of electronic participation take off. But the criticism of whether the government actually takes any of this seriously or not, that criticism has been made in Taiwan as well. That the kinds of questions that they're willing to put before people are within specific parameters, and they don't want people debating outside of those parameters.
Yeah, I think that concern in some ways is more serious, because essentially what you have is the government framing the questions, as you say, that are up for debate, and then an LLM that is controlled by the government doing the content analysis that floats up what are determined to be the most important themes in the public debate. So you and I are talking about something, or let's say there's 10 of us talking about a policy debate, and then LLM follows the conversation and floats up what it takes to be the most important themes. If you combine that with the government asking the question on the one hand, and the technology deciding what the most important part of our conversation is on the other, it puts a bit of a damper on how much direct, spontaneous participation this actually counts as.
Yeah, you could see the Putin regime adopting this, right? They would love to say, should we completely annihilate Ukraine or just half annihilate Ukraine, and debate away.
Yeah. But as a philosophical move, part of like what I'm interested in doing is sort of, what if you assume X hypothesis that these problems are solved? So assume that the government has absolute goodwill in deciding what questions to float, and that they do their best in floating questions that they genuinely think are of public interest, and assume they really work with quality control on the LLM to be, fair as much as possible in doing the content analysis on the conversation, so that there's no bias in what gets forwarded to them as discussion. If that's the case, and we also have to, by the way, note that all of this, at least in places like Taiwan, is predicated on a high level of media literacy and on good infrastructure of broadband. Assume all of that is taken care of, though. For you, are there any problems left with this?
No, I think the research that's been done on electronic participation points up the same problems that we have in face-to-face democracy, in that some voices, some kinds of participation are certain kinds of people are more likely to participate. So the education gap is one huge thing. When you put the education gap on top of the digital divide, which is not huge in places like Taiwan or South Korea, which have excellent connectivity, but still there are older people who are not as used to using digital participation tools. When you put that on top of the education gaps that already less educated people are less likely to participate in politics than educated people, then you have still a problem with whose voices are being amplified by these tools and technologies or given a more democratic gloss. So that's one of my big concerns with this, is that it really doesn't solve the problem of universal participation. And I think that's related to the problem that which this is trying to solve, which is that participating in politics is time consuming, taxing in various ways. If you try to be educated to any degree about any topic, you immediately get into layers and layers of debate about it and disinformation that you have to parse through and so forth. So I think, these tools are pointed in the right direction because we want citizens to have easier ways to participate than the even more laborious face-to-face methods. But I don't know that we've cracked the nut yet.
Yeah. And now, if I understand correctly, also through Pol.is and some of these other technologies, some of the participation is kind of quick. How do you feel about X surveys where you can answer like with one word, right? Like, so how do you feel about increasing government subsidies for broadband? And you'd say warm and fuzzy or crappy, or they're not very involved, thought through, nuanced answers all the times.
An example I used to use with survey design classes is questions about abortion rights, because you have some standard sets of like 6 exceptions to abortion rights. And for any circumstance, because the mother can't afford another child, those are less likely to be affirmed, but then rape and incest, and then under no circumstances. And the point I would make to students is, the debate between like rape and incest and under any circumstances, that's relatively discrete set of movements of your position. But the folks who are over here with under no circumstances, there's no compromise to be had. And what Pol.is is trying to do is trying to say, well, there's the under no circumstances folks, and there's the rape and incest folks, and then there's the under all circumstances folks. And let's upvote all the comments that are in the middle that are somehow affirmed by the other side. And it's like, at a certain point, for certain, for Uber regulations, which was one of the first things that was applied to, apparently it worked relatively well. And Uber regulations are a different kind of beast than fundamental questions of human rights. So I think it works better for some kinds of questions than for others.
Yeah. And I'm assuming it can be calibrated to either prefer compromise positions or not.
Yes. That Pol.is is specifically designed to try to upvote the compromise, but an ordinary system I've always wanted just an automated Robert Rules of Order system. I know that there's some experiments with that out there, but Robert's Rules of Order doesn't try to necessarily produce compromise, but it just gives everybody very explicit rules about how you debate and how you get to a conclusion. And I think that would be as useful as Pol.is probably.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. Namely, how appropriate is this for issues that are at the heart of the culture wars?
Yeah. Slavery or not slavery? Let's find a compromise.
Right. The sense seems to be that you would actually need political participation to be most serious at the issues that are at the heart of the culture wars. But for those issues, it seems to work.
Well, I was just listening to a fascinating interview with Audrey Tang, and she was talking about the fact that China, the Chinese cyber warriors, apparently do a lot of research into splitting questions that will evenly split a population between the people who can absolutely not agree with the other side on this particular way that the question's asked, and that they try to infuse those as part of their psyops against Taiwan. They infuse those into debates in Taiwan. So, that to the degree to which we can identify that and diffuse that, that's great. But as I said, there are certain questions that are fundamentally divisive.
Yeah. So as in your slavery comment and as in your earlier comment about abortion, it seems like there are, I'm just trying to see if I'm understanding your point correctly. It seems like there's issues for which a technology calibrated towards finding compromise is just inappropriate. And where you would actually want the battle lines to be drawn as clearly as possible so that really know where people stand on absolutely fundamental issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think as we're facing this electoral cycle, it's clear that not only are there issues in which we're fundamentally divided, but we're divided on the reality. That's the other thing that's lurking in the background is to the extent that our epistemic realities become divorced from each, other parts of the citizenry. We're not even arguing about the same thing anymore. We're talking past each other.
Yeah, yeah, which, when I was reading about this, I was reminded of like Rousseau's introductory letter in the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. He writes this love letter to the city of Geneva. And basically his point is I would have wanted, if I could choose, where to live, I would have wanted to live in a relatively small, cohesive, coherent community where, enough of the people so that government itself doesn't become abstract, where the level of delegation is not so complicated that, there's no accountability, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like in some fashion, these digital participation technologies would work better either in a newer democracy, like you're saying, although Rousseau was adamant that he wouldn't want to live in a new democracy that hasn't figured any of these things out, or in a kind of more cohesive, what you might call an even ethnically cohesive republic, where at least there is epistemic unity, people agree on the facts, and there's a level of trust in institutions that is just a fantasy in larger countries.
Well, I think sociologically, if you look at the problems of democracies around the world, the one of the frames that we put them in is whether there are cross-cutting allegiances or whether the allegiances are aligned. In other words, if you have a country like, say, Belgium, where half is Protestant, half is Catholic, half speaks one language, the other half speaks the other language, half is more social democratic, half is more conservative, you're going to have problems. You're going to have potentially civil conflict. But if you are in a country where half of the Catholics are feminists and half aren't, and et cetera, all the allegiances are cross-cutting, then you have a much stronger democracy. So I think that's one of the constraints that all these things would, and in the United States, as I was saying, epistemically, if you're in MAGA, you're in a completely different reality. You're also more likely to be rural, you're more likely to be white, you're more likely to be all these other things. So that we have had we've had an alignment of various kinds of social cleavages with our partisan alignments in the United States that makes democracy just that much harder. So I guess it's one of my hopes for the future is that that we don't that we have more and more intermixing of these allegiances, so that it becomes clear that if you're X, you don't have to have one particular viewpoint on the world.
Yeah, I guess on that, I mean, to me, part of what's going to encourage and facilitate some of these intermixings in the end is going to be actual face-to-face debates and participations, even if it's more time consuming, even if it requires a greater degree of, commitment, even if it's harder. Going back to what you started with, I mean, for me, the real problem I have to confess here is even if you keep everything else stable and you kind of assume that all of the other problems with these technologies are solved. To me, the issue is that there's a inappropriate tech solutionism sort of baked into this. You started with talking about the bowling alone problem with the sort of the decline of institutions like church and social clubs and other ways in which people meet that form the basis of democracy. Having conversations on Zoom where an LLM floats up the themes of your conversation to even a benign big brother government, to me, that doesn't solve the problem. And to me, that's kind of decaffeinated participation, really. That's like diet political participation. There's something to be said, I guess, on what I'm trying to say, not fully articulately. There's something to be said for face-to-face participation, physically sort of meeting in the public square where you kind of have to see the other people, where you have to compromise with them because they're physically co-present with you in the same space, where you have to sort of, as it were, deal with the fact of their physical existence. So, I mean, we go back to a bunch of debates that you and I have always had on the question of the real, that it still seems to be that there's real political participation that would involve physical co-presence and less real political participation.
Well,
What's your sense of that? So,
I affirm the ideal, the notion that it would be ideal if we could all get in a room and just hash things out. But I live in a small town. I live in small town Connecticut, which has a long tradition of the town hall and open town meetings. I've been in the 25 years I've lived there. I've gone to 3 town meetings. I find just even paying any attention to my local town issues to be time consuming and difficult, given the kinds of things I like to pay attention to. So
yeah. But then you
I,
wouldn't do it on Zoom either.
well, they've had during COVID, they started to have those on Zoom, and I was more likely. I did attend one on Zoom. I was more likely to attend those. I think, there's lots of people who can't physically participate. So let's just acknowledge that the
Right.
idea that everyone has to get their butt up and get to a town hall meeting is absurd in some of the larger and more gerrymandered parts of the United States. If you're in Utah or Nevada, there may not be people for 60 miles or whatever. Then there's the people who just can't, and we're going to be an older and older society. And as we get older, we're going to have more disabilities. So the idea that we're going to be only enfranchising people who are mobile and motivated, usually highly educated or more educated than the people who don't participate. So
Agreed, absolutely.
yeah.
But that's an argument for making it hybrid, and not an argument for completely replacing it. I mean, the Taiwan technologies don't build themselves as an accessibility technology. They build themselves as, here's how we are going to solve political participation for people who, otherwise won't do it. And there's an argument to push people to otherwise do it. So in other words, Zoom rooms are not the solution to the bowling alone problems. The real solution is, finding a way to restart bowling clubs.
I guess where you and I differ is I just think that the face to face has some of the same problems that the electronic participation does. That I agree with you that there's no tech solution here, except if it allows people to participate more easily. And somehow these electronic tools do actually have an effect of reducing certain kinds of conflict. Unmoderated online debate has generally been acknowledged to increase the amount of polarization and the amplification of divisive voices and so forth. So it really depends on the efficacy of a system like Pol.is that is attempting to tamp that down.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if in some cases it doesn't kind of give people a sort of false sense of virtue and achievement for political participation. It's again, I go back to the question of decaffeinated or cheap participation.
Well, that might be an interesting segue. I mean, for the last 3 weeks, I've been trying to teach myself how to up my social media game as as a form of political participation here in the United States. And is it real? My kids keep reminding me. My kids who are both union organizers. I keep reminding me that face to face is more important than electronic, but it's like, who am I going to organize face to face? The only people I am face to face with is like you and half a dozen other people. So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, it is interesting. The version of this that takes off in the last few weeks, for example, in the United States, is the massive Zoom rallies for Kamala Harris. And, there's the White Dudes for Harris and other groups that organized. That's what the group was called. And
yesterday was Evangelicals for Harris, I think.
Evangelicals for Harris. Was that a large group?
200,000 people signed up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And, I guess part of the attraction was that it feels a little bit more, it feels informal. It feels a little spontaneous. I was listening to Kevin Roos from the New York Times on his podcast, where he was talking about the celebrities showing up with their dogs in the background and bad lighting in their garages, and everybody was a little bit humanized. But of course, on the very medium, the very attempt to do that immediately gets politicized, right? And just like everything else, from masks to vaccines, et cetera, now Zoom becomes for, something for, those silly soft liberals that have to air out their feelings virtually. And,
The right has webinars too. I mean, it's not just the soft liberals who are attracted to the webinars,
well,
but it has been a phenomenon. It has been a weird phenomenon, the kind of identity-based reinvention of the
yeah,
telephone.
I'm quoting from the right here. They've
Yeah,
immediately politicized, the very idea of having a Zoom rally, right? So even, in other words, it seems like another piece of evidence that this kind of digital participation is in this country a pipe dream, because it depends in the first place on a degree of coherence and mutual trust that doesn't exist here, couldn't exist here.
Well, a webinar for like white dudes for Harris. I'm sure that there were non-white dudes for Harris and Trumpers on that call, right? But if that's the reason you hold a webinar. We've had experiences with Zoom bombing before.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, the tools now allow the controlled expression of who's online and a generally positive response from the audience as you see everything scroll past on the comments feed. But I think those have been relatively successful, and they've raised a lot of money. But I think, the longer history of this question with this election is that we've had, since the 90s, we've had various experiments with using internet tools for elections, or internet connectivity for elections. Howard Dean was a pioneer. Obama was a pioneer. Bernie was a pioneer. But none of them really produced lasting institutions or mobilization. Like Bernie's operation turned into Our Revolution, which is a PAC, and it contacts people for funds and distributes funds and so forth, just like all the other PACs. But they haven't really taken the place of a kind of intra-party mechanisms that we would really need to strengthen participatory democracy. So we'll just have to see. I don't think the Zoom rallies are going to strengthen participatory democracy, but yeah.
Let me pick your brain on something, because one thing I found interesting about the Taiwan story was that they make this distinction between digital literacy and digital competence.
Mm-hmm.
And digital literacy is broadly, you teach kids to tell the difference between fake news and real news. You teach them what the signs to become suspicious are about a deep fake video, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You teach them how to cross-check a piece of information that they come across in TikTok or what have you. And I guess digital competence, as opposed to digital literacy, has to do with learning how to positively do things with technology, how to organize on social media, what you're trying to learn now, how to participate or run a Pol.is kind of poll, et cetera, et cetera. So use digital tools for democratic participation. So one is a passive capacity, the other, I guess, is billed as an active capacity. By and large, from what I can tell, in the US, we profoundly suck at both. Digital literacy is in its very early stages, and digital competence efforts don't really exist. How important do you think these things are, and what kind of future do you think they have, these efforts to sort of integrate these skills into the curricula?
Well, whenever I try to learn a new computer skill, if I'm not immediately applying it, I don't find it's very useful to study anything. And now I'm trying to teach myself how to make a TikTok, for instance, and I have a clear motivation for why I want to do that. My kids are both, as I said, union organizers, and when they were kids, they didn't have any interest in data science with my day job. But then when they became union officials, they realized, hey, I could organize this big thing in Excel or Python. They started teaching themselves how to program. I think every occupation will face the skills gap as younger people who are more technically proficient come online. And that's true of citizen participation as well. People who know how to make a Substack, the podcasting that we're doing, any of the other forms of participation, they're going to have a leg up. So I do think that educating younger people about that kind of digital competence skills is important. The problem is that the tools will be moving so quickly that I don't know about the role of formal education here. I mean, when I was 12, my dad, who was a Blue Cross executive, determined that I needed to know about computers in the future. This was like 1973. Took me to work to Blue Cross and taught me how to program BASIC with punch cards. And he was right about computers being the future, and it probably learning BASIC contributed to my general understanding of computing, but it wasn't the skill that was going to make me, a better digital citizen in the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm of two minds on this because, the alternative to, given that the amount of time that's available to schooling at all levels is limited, you could spend time on digital literacy and digital competence. You could also spend your time and energy on, and increasingly that's happening, on getting people off of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of reclaiming their capacity to concentrate, reclaiming their capacity for interpersonal relationships, reclaiming their capacity to pay attention, et cetera, et cetera. Whether you can realistically do both, I don't know. I guess I think that's a still open question. So I'm genuinely ambivalent about digital literacy and digital competence. And again, I think it goes back to the epistemic point you made earlier. In order to become digitally literate and digitally competent, there has to be some rudimentary understanding about the standard of what it is to be literate and what it is to be competent. And I can see that existing much more in Taiwan and Estonia than I think it exists here. So it's almost like a chicken and egg problem that you have to have a pre-existing degree of social trust and of agreement on what counts as a fact for those efforts to work in the first place. And we don't have that.
Facing an existential threat 60 miles off your border just sometimes tends to focus the mind of the citizenry. Although they do have some pretty, they have pro CCP voices in Taiwan and some electoral representation even. On the question of misinformation, I was struck this week that the EU issued a warning to Elon Musk before he interviewed Trump the other night. And they warned him that his right to operate in Europe was conditioned on the fact that X or Twitter not become a platform for election disinformation in particular, spreading lies about the last election. And I was really impressed with that in the first place because, if America goes fascist, I want Europe to come to our rescue like we came to theirs. But in the second place, here is an example of regulatory intervention bolstering this kind of digital competence that we're talking about. Is the expectation that citizens have to protect themselves against spam mean that we shouldn't have regulation against spam? No, or cyber theft or routine disinformation, hate speech online. So for me, it always comes back to the regulatory question. It's like fine, yeah, citizens should do X. You should be a better informed person when you make decisions. You should have a preference for face-to-face communication or whatever. But what are the regulatory things that we can do to encourage one outcome versus another?
Yeah, your comment makes me think about if we are going to embrace digital participation as sort of key to new democracy, then digital participation on Twitter has to count as well. And the 1.3 million people listening into that conversation should be deemed as engaged in political participation. And so you have a very value neutral, if you will, definition of what counts as political participation. But by and large, I have to say, and I'm kind of slightly changing the topic from your question about regulation, but I can't say I've been terribly impressed by political participation on Twitter. There's great degree. There's more
debate there than there is on the other platforms, but that's not saying much.
Yeah, but there's there's something about the debate there that I mean, I'm sure you've had this is not an original point. I'm sure you've had the same experience. I've seen the same people grandstand and sort of peacock on Twitter in extremely unpleasant ways. And then when you actually talk to them in person, they are much more nuanced and sort of seem to be able to think in much more complicated ways. And, sure, part of that is the space limit on Twitter, but I think a much bigger part of it is the sort of psychological tendency that the platform elicits. And you ask yourself, what's the point? If the point is, fulfilling people's narcissistic needs and grandstanding and peacocking, great, but that's not political participation. That's, psychopathology after a certain level. So, does something like Pol.is sort of solve that problem? I guess,
Well,
where this is going is that the medium...
the logic of Polis could be applied in Twitter,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it would be contrary to the profit making eyeball grabbing that all the platforms are motivated by, right? That's why if you wanted a different kind of algorithmic outcome, you have to put the kind of regulatory screws to the platforms that got Facebook, for instance, to down a vote in its algorithm political divisive speech and to do better job of tracking hate speech.
Yeah, I guess I do think that's absolutely right and a crucial point that you have to play with the economic incentives. But I think there's a fundamental point that's unsolvable, which is that the nature of the nature of the platform changes the nature of the participation. That in the end, there's a sort of to go back to that term, a tech solutionism at play here, which is, yeah, of course, the kids hate to talk by phone personally. They, get anxious to hear somebody else's voice. Let's give them a way to participate via text, or let's give them a way to participate via, Reddit style upvoting and downvoting and still count that as participation. But that is exactly the sort of Coke-Zero version of political participation. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say here is almost in a sort of Aristotelian vein. Maybe there is a more objective definition and set of criteria for what counts as participating, that participating on a platform where you sort of are not together with other people and you have an LLM mediating the value of your responses to the powers that be simply doesn't count as participation, rather than counts as enhancing it.
Well, I think we should probably experiment with it. Maybe we can get an installation of Pol.is and see if it helps us come to philosophical conclusions. Chalmers does these surveys of philosophers every so often, and to ask them about 50 different or 150 different philosophical questions. It'd be interesting if they were to do a similar thing with Pol.is and see if they could get anybody to agree.
It's a good example. Do you really want to encourage the awkward philosophers who can't stand to talk to each other anyway to have even more ways of not seeing each other in person?
You're a substance dualist and you're an eliminativist. Isn't there a compromise? We were going to touch on one more thing, which was the Google antitrust, which is big news in tech. The DC District Court has ruled that Google has abused its monopoly over search, and they're pursuing remedies such as forcing them to sell off Android and/or the Chrome browser to change the way that people install search options in their operating systems. Any thoughts? I'm as a socialist, I'm always of half a mind that, well, let's not break this up, let's just nationalize it. But I don't think that actually is that great a solution in this case.
Yeah, so we're elegantly and seamlessly moving to our news roundup segment. So as far as I know, we're still a way off from remedies in the Google case. So at this point, the key development is that Google was declared to be in violation of antitrust law and was declared to be a monopoly mainly for paying these platforms to feature its search as the default. And I guess the remedies that people are talking about as possible remedies, once remedies are handed down, is either making it illegal for Google to pay Apple, Samsung, what have you, to feature the Google search engine as the default, or potentially doing what they do in the EU of having a choice screen, right, where you would have a real possibility of choosing Google or something else. I mean, I guess one question that I thought was really interesting that came up in that trial is, was the claim plausible that Google was making that everybody is using the product simply because it's a lot better? Or was everybody using the product and because it was monopolistic and the monopoly itself was what was making it better? Namely, they got so much money that they could keep investing so much money and so much data by the monopolistic practices that the product was going to have to get better. I guess one question that I had as I was listening to all of this is, this seems to be one of those cases that maybe by the time that it's decided, the technology will make it mute
That's probably true.
because so much search is going to move to large language models anyway, so that in some way, Google is killing its very own business model, right, by replacing search with search summaries from LLM. So, that's one question that I don't quite know the answer to.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, your point about the seamlessness and the integration as a benefit. For me, the using the Chrome browser and Android on my phone and the Google operating system for like Google Docs. We organized this podcast with Google Doc, and we store these audio files in our Google Drive. So the integration of all that for me has been positive, and I know that Google knows more about me than anyone should know about anyone else, but so far it hasn't been a problem, and I trust them more than I would trust 50 random other people that other firms, that if this was in a more antitrusted environment. So I'm of two minds actually about breaking up this standardization that's achieved by natural monopolies. But I think one of the things that the judge was looking at was the economic argument: is that is there evidence that there are competitors who could have competed in this domain, but because of Google's casual monopolistic behavior, we're not able to get a foothold?
Yeah. First of all, I just have to point out that it's very enjoyable to hear my techno-progressive friend make the libertarian point.
I'm making a pro-monopoly argument that Marx made. It's like the natural tendency of all capital is towards monopoly, and then you take it over.
Well, you're saying this works, which is the point that Google was making in the trial, that this works beautifully for people. It's a very good product. Why talk about, the sort of speculative benefits of a competitor that doesn't exist when this is a monopoly that has actually proved that it will continue to improve the product, which is an interesting point. They did continue to improve the product in spite of monopoly, which is supposed to be the big fear of being a monopoly.
Often the improvements came from buying competitors, and there was a whole like logic for 20 years in Silicon Valley. You try to get big enough and successful enough to get bought. So
right.
Is that real competition? I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one area where this becomes problematic is if the future, for example, of the country, as some fear, is less democratic than it used to be, then all of a sudden it becomes a lot more problematic that there's a platform like this that knows everything there is to know about you, and it was never a problem before, but it might become a problem thereafter. That obviously wasn't part of the arguments in the trial. By the way, what's your sense of, this is a related question, but what's your sense of the upcoming disappearance of traditional search?
Well, I'm not sure people are going to adapt to it that quickly. I tend to still prefer to see, the top 10 search items instead of the summary. But for this, as I was preparing the notes for this podcast, I went in and asked, what are the top 10 accomplishments of Taiwan's e-democracy? What are the top 10 criticisms? I gave it to 4 different LLMs. They all came up with roughly similar answers and good references and links that actually worked, things that actually existed.
Yeah.
So, to the extent that we're moving in that direction, and I think there's a lot of interesting noise coming out of OpenAI about them moving to the next stage, which is more agentic performance. So, in other words, you would be able to tell it, keep an eye out for these kinds of things and send me summaries of them, which you can kind of get with ResearchGate. You can tell ResearchGate or academia.edu when someone publishes a paper on this topic, send it to me. But you could have just research assistants who know what you want and who are feeding you the little tidbits that you need and organizing it for you. And that's just one of the many agentic things, buying your plane tickets, planning your vacation, cooking, preparing, telling you how to prepare your meals at any rate. All those kinds of agentic behaviors are the next thing that they're offering. And that's where I think this integration is, my expectation is that the integration will be a huge benefit, that knowing everything that you do online through your phone, through your tablet, through your laptop, having that complete body of knowledge will be a huge benefit to having an agent that's really able to serve your needs.
Yeah, except that you will gradually stop being the agent as a result. But
well, yeah, to the extent that I stopped knowing how to fix my wiring in my house when I hired an electrician or any of the other things that I've outsourced. I mean, if civilization were to go away tomorrow, we'd all starve to death. So
right. Well, I have something specific in mind. So last year, I gave my students this assignment where I asked them to answer the same question, one through traditional Google search and one through working with an LLM. And I asked them both for the different answers, but also for a description of the difference in the experiences of research. And I was surprised that a lot of them came back. I don't think this was because they were sort of trying to please me with the right answer. A lot of them came back with they would prefer to stay with the traditional Google search if it was up to them. And part of it was that the LLM gave them a sort of overview when it wasn't hallucinating of the question, but a sort of almost digested, narratively coherent overview. And the other one forced them by looking at more than one source and by using their judgment to decide which sources were more reliable than others to come up with their own view. So for me, this is a much more interesting question about whether Google is a monopoly or not, would be, contemporary Google searches involve a degree of human judgment and human agency on the one hand, which I think is very good if you're going beyond the 10 top results, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, they depend on the advertising business model, which is toxic and profoundly problematic.
yeah.
And I think changing that to an LLM research or search model would most likely get rid of the advertising-based business model or change it pretty significantly, but would also harm the agency and use of judgment that's involved in the traditional Google search. So to me, the much bigger question than whether Google is a monopoly or not is whether advertising as the basis of the business model of so many of these companies is eventually going to go away because of the introduction of large language models.
Well, I think, what the real question is going to be is who will Google and Google competitors be willing to negotiate contracts with for licensed availability to their data. So, the New York Times has entered into that kind of negotiation with Google, as far as I understand, to be paid a certain amount for the right to present abstracts of New York Times information in their enormous archive. Other firms, that have paywalls or advertising on their site may not want to, Google may not be willing to license things from them. And in which case they're probably going to be out of luck.
Yeah.
But, and then at the bottom end, you've got do not crawl kind of things. I mean, we've got the agreement that LLMs should in the future be only built on data that has been agreed to be in the public domain or that there has been some kind of licensing arrangement for. And so if you put a do not crawl on, then you might not be included in any of the corpus of human information in the future. So, I mean, I understand that it's a dilemma, but I think there are some workarounds potentially, but they wouldn't bring in the same kind of advertising revenue that they're going to lose.
Yeah.
Okay,
All
man.
right, sir.
Well, we'll check back in with everybody in 2 weeks. And thanks for joining us for the Prosthetic Gods podcast.